This podcast discusses child sexual abuse and the impacts of harm on children and families. While we won't include graphic detail, some listeners may find this content distressing. Please take care while listening and consider pausing or seeking support if you need to. There's many and varied support services available, including Lifeline on 13 11 14, Kids Helpline for 5 to 25-year-olds on 1800 55 1800, and the Sexual Assault Helpline on 1800 010 120. If you're outside of Australia, we encourage you to seek a local support service. Welcome to this episode, Beth. You've been working with the Daniel Morcombe Foundation, a brilliant organisation in the education space, which is a key recommendation from the In Plain Sight report. So thank you so much for being with us today. Your insights are so valuable. Your work with the Daniel Morcombe Foundation really focuses on education as a frontline prevention tool. Based on what this review has found, where do you think education has the greatest potential to disrupt harm before it occurs?
So the In Plain Sight report, which is groundbreaking, it's groundbreaking, but it's built on a lot of other work that's been happening for decades, particularly the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. But this particular report has built on that evidence base, which is that education is prevention, and we need prevention education to be able to stop harm before it occurs. When I think of that, I'm thinking from like a universal perspective. So the work that we do at Daniel Morcombe Foundation is that we go in and we educate kids directly about their protective behaviours, so recognise, react, report. We also educate the adults around those kids, so teachers, carers, parents, volunteers. And so it's about educating everyone. I think to go to the heart of your question, though, given that In Plain Sight is about the early years, I really think prevention education needs to start before birth. So I think of it in the sense that when we look at how we've addressed domestic and family violence, we've got domestic violence routine screening. So a nurse will often ask a question of a expecting mum or parent that, what's happening in the home? Is there any violence? Is there coercive control? I would love to see that happen and broaden out for child sexual abuse as well, because you'll often find with parents and adults that are around kids that there will be inclinations that something's not right. So we know from the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study that expecting parents often can have child maltreatment themselves. So they're going into that parenting, very difficult role and rewarding role, but with their own experiences. And we need to ensure that that they've got the support that they need to be able to work through what they've been through and have someone to talk to. When we look at the stats around ACMS, we can assume that everyone that we know in some capacity knows someone who's experienced abuse or maltreatment. In the same vein, we also know that they probably know someone who's harmed in some way. So education needs to broaden out to educate parents, carers around how they can prevent this at the start with the kids in their lives. And I think about under fives, there's children that are non-verbal, so they're very dependent on the adults around them to keep them safe.
The report identifies as an opportunity to improve how we recognise the signs of abuse, particularly in children who are non-verbal. Where do you see the opportunity to strengthen communication with non-verbal children, or at least awareness about communicating with non-verbal children?
Yeah. A lot of this comes down to the relationship between children and adults. And so for adults who are surrounding and supporting those kids who are non-verbal, it'll be about understanding that child. So understanding behaviours, understanding the signs. So for them, having education around what that looks like. What does trauma look like for a little one who's been through one of the maltreatments or multiple maltreatments? So for them, a lot of that's going to be educating the adults who are working either in a professional caring capacity or in a home-based caring capacity to identify those signs. And also for the little ones, it's about having them feel safe. It's, safety is it's the cornerstone of all of this. So, and a lot of that comes down to relationship, but also context. So when we think about what's come out of In Plain Sight, it's, we think about architecture, and we think about the physical context as well that kids are in, and how do we ensure that kids are able to communicate? What are the communication tools that they have within those physical spaces that help support them to communicate to the adults around them that they've been harmed? Some of that kids who are nonverbal, they communicate a lot through artwork, and there's research that Frida Briggs did decades ago around how kids communicated distress through artwork, and I think there's some really great stuff that people can look to in educating themselves around how a child might be expressing that they're in distress.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. One of the strongest messages in this review is that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. It's a message that we hear all the time. From your experience with the Daniel Morcombe Foundation and as a social worker, what cultural shift is most urgently needed in organisations that work with children?
The big cultural shift, and I feel like we're on the precipice of that happening now, is child safe orgs, for instance. It's, policies and practice. We all know that we've got to get child safeguarding policies in check. But the big shift is the cultural shift around everyone understanding that child wellbeing is what we're aiming for. You can do the academic work, you can do sport, you can do music and arts, but if a child isn't healthy, happy, safe, then they're not going to be able to engage in those activities in the same way. So it's upskilling the whole community. So not just the child safety officer, not just the leadership team, especially the leadership team though, but everyone, volunteers, the professionals in any capacity, the adults that work with kids. And I just think that we say it's everybody's business. We also want to talk to them about what role they play within that. So leadership do have a specific role, and they need to be held to high account because we just know that this is endemic. Child sexual abuse is endemic. It's one of those crime types that's going up, not going down. So we really need to educate people in those roles to understand the risk. Because I think the risk is really important. What we learnt in the time that I was at the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and sadly, is that sometimes when you hit these organisations in the hip pocket, it's going to drive change, and it's going to drive it quite quickly. So we need to build that risk profile into organisations. But outside of that, it is about it's giving folks agency. I think when I think about the educators in this space, they need to feel agency to be able to report, because it's one thing to know how to identify this. So we prevent, we identify, we respond. So they'll be in the role of identifying it. If something's happened, then what do they do? How do they report? And how do you report when you've got co-workers who you probably friends with, or who you're worried about, what's going to happen, and if you don't know that much information. So we really want to shift the culture to one where it's not about blame in the way that we think about it. It's more about how do we hold organisations accountable, how do we hold individuals accountable for their behaviour and for keeping kids safe. So I think it's a cultural shift that needs to happen on multiple levels. It's structural, it's individual, and it's all of it. It's all of those pieces coming together so that it's a comprehensive cultural shift around how we keep kids safe.
What I'm hearing from you there is that failure to speak up and report is a barrier. How does education practically, how do you see that looking in practice?
Yeah, I think just basically understanding what child sexual abuse is. So many people don't know what it is. So some explicit teachings around that for the kids, for young people, and we've there's a lot of research now around protective behaviours, like the strengths of that. I know that there's criticisms of protective behaviours. Some of the criticisms in the past have been that we're holding kids accountable for their own safety. I think it's just one piece of a bigger puzzle. It's the last line of defence, really. If someone who is intent on harming children has gotten into an organisation and they are intent on harming a child, then that's the last line of defence, is that we've educated a child on how to identify, so how to recognise, react and report. been through. Ideally, though, prevention is not about really true core prevention is about adults preventing it from getting to that point. So identifying the grooming, identifying the blurring of lines and the blurring of barriers, which in plain sight, often when these educators talk about it afterwards, they can say, my stomach, I just didn't feel right. I saw this interaction and it just didn't feel right, but I didn't know what to do. So it's about, again, equipping people to speak up early so that it doesn't get to that point. But really, if we can go in and do something with kids in schools and young people, it is explicit education. It is about talking directly about what child sexual abuse is. I know it's a really difficult subject, but the more that we take away the shame and the burden of this being something about an individual, survivors for too long have carried guilt and shame that it was their fault in some way. It absolutely is not their fault. The person who harmed is 100% accountable for that abuse. But I think we need to be talking earlier, talking often. It's talk early, talk often is a program as well. I just think that's such language is so important in all of this. We were talking yesterday on a group actually that's developing some training about how we can put statistics out there. We can say, 50%, 60%, in this case it's 1 in 4. But we really need to shift that language so that it's, that this is common. Child sexual abuse is common. It's everyone's going to have someone in their life who's been through that. So we need to talk in a way that's translational for folks who are parenting, caring, who are time poor, who haven't had the education. I can tell you, I'm 40. I didn't grow up with this education in my school. I didn't grow up with relationship and sexuality or sex education in general. So I work in the sector, and I'm resourceful in that I've been educated, but I think we need to work from the basis that there's going to be people in the community who have not had. They're at the very different starting point from the professionals. So we need to be working so that it's translational and applicable across the whole community.
There's many priorities in this space. Where would you put grooming on that spectrum, education around grooming on that spectrum?
Again, comprehensive response to child sexual abuse includes all of it, but it is up there. I think if we can identify those behaviours early. We've spent a lot of time, and this is credit to victim survivors who've come forward and talked about the experiences. We've spent a lot of time learning about that. We've spent not as much time learning about the people who engage in these harms. And I think we've got some fabulous people in Australia. Associate Professor Daniela Lander Harris, who I'm not sure if you're talking to her on this podcast, but she's really fabulous. Professor Elizabeth Letourneau over in the US, who works for the Moore Centre. There have been people who have dedicated their careers to understanding those behaviours and educating us in a very translational way about how we can identify those behaviours early. I do want to say my area I work in, we're right upstream. So we're working with children and young people who engage in harmful sexual behaviours as well. And language, again, is so important around that. There are some young people who do engage in grooming. The vast majority of children and young people who engage in harmful sexual behaviours are opportunistic. They're impulsive. There's a whole heap of things around what they don't know around sex and things that they aren't educated. So we need to upskill them around what is okay and what's not okay. But if we're talking about adults who are in this case, the Ashley Paul Griffiths case, we really need to equip co-workers, parents, carers, leadership, particularly leadership, because they can act. And we saw in this scenario where leadership didn't act, and it could have really diverted the course of a lot of these cases. So grooming's really a really important thing. Professor Elizabeth Letourneau from the Moore Centre, she does some education programs in school, which is about going in and educating kids directly around harmful sexual behaviours and talking to them about, obviously, consent education and relationship and sexuality education, but also about harmful sexual behaviours and what that looks like. I think if we could get to that point where we're putting the spotlight on the person who's going to engage in those behaviours, then we're going to be a lot closer to preventing this crime type, this harm type. And just really think that it's where we need to be we're very lucky in Australia as well, because we've got the Stop It Now program, which I'm sure someone else on this podcast has spoken about. But that's for adult men, mostly adult men, who can call and get support for their sexual thoughts towards children. We're also trying to get, and hopefully we do get it here in Australia, the What's Okay program, which is for children and young people who are worried about their sexual thoughts, maybe their pornography usage and witnessing of child sexual abuse material. So if we can get to that point in prevention, I just think we've done a lot. We've come a long way, but we've still got a way to go.
The review makes clear that children do often try to speak up before harm escalates. From an education perspective, how do we better equip children to recognise unsafe behaviour, but equally get adults to hear them and act on what they say?
Yeah, I think it just builds on the other questions you've been asking, Kirstine. I think it is about educating kids directly in ways that are age appropriate, trauma informed, trauma aware. So this training that we've been developing, or supporting some other organisations to develop alongside us, has been about the cascading workforce. So what is it that we need to teach leaders? What is it that we need to teach frontline practitioners? What is it that we need to teach the mental health coordinators and the health and safety officers? What is it that we need to teach volunteers? And then parents, carers, and then kids. So we've done a lot of co-design and co-development with those groups around what's the best way for them to learn. What we hear time and time again is that people are time poor. So how do we make this a constant? So not just a 1 hour session, but a constant conversation. I think, again, in Australia, we've got the fabulous Chanel Contos, and what she's done around consent education, the campaign Teachers Consent, has really, it's changed Australia. So now that we've got consent education from kindy all the way through to high school, we can say that, there's something there. It's not perfect. We know that it's not being rolled out in the way that we might have intended it to in some schools, and that's a real shame. There's other schools who are doing really fabulous work, but I do think the fact that we're here at this point where people know that that's part of the prevention. So part of the prevention for child sexual abuse with kids directly is about teaching them about bodily autonomy. So being able to name their body parts, not being ashamed of that, not calling it down there, calling it by its name, vagina, penis, vulva. Being able to talk about children's rights is really important, because children have rights. Wellbeing is really important. Children's wellbeing is massively important, but they've also got rights to be healthy and safe. Yeah. That is their right, not to be harmed. And then consent education is such a big one. The other thing that we are trying to do at the Daniel Morcombe Foundation is really promote help seeking for the different age groups. This is hard because they're under 5, but this again, like we talked about earlier, there will be kids that will be disclosing in different ways, and I just find with the little ones, they're testing the waters really often about whether someone can hear them, or whether they've probably got very little understanding of what's happened to them as well. And as kids get older, they'll test the water really differently. So it's understanding the developmental stages for kids, how they disclose differently, how they try to find out whether you're an adult who's going to listen to them and believe them and help support them. But yeah, this one size fits all approach just doesn't work. Like I said earlier, everyone's at a different starting point. So we need to understand what that point is for them. A really big one as well is about place-based responses. So what's going to work where I live, up on Gubby country, is going to be very different from what happens down here in Meanjin. And then again, when you go out to rural and remote Australia. So I think you've got to be place-based. You've got to be understanding of the diverse needs of each group in each area. And we talk a lot about intersectionality now, which is so cool that that's become just part of the common vernacular. But it really is about that, how does the structural systems intersect with the individual identities, and
work together.
Yeah, how do they work together?
Finally, we've spoken about lots of actions for professionals in the education space to improve and strengthen safeguarding of children. What's your message for parents walking who are listening to this conversation? What's your message to them about their role in prevention? We'll start there.
I really think parents and carers, for the most part, are doing the best they can, and there's a lot. I think of we're talking about child sexual abuse as if it exists in this vacuum, but it's often, as we know from the ACMS and the multi-maltreatment studies, this often co-occurs with other harms. It co-occurs with poverty. It co-occurs with a whole range of things that happen. And so I think for parents and carers who are struggling and who are trying to do the best they can, it's about how do they lean on the systems, supports, other people around them. How do they feel brave enough to talk about their concerns or their worries? And that's a really tough thing to do. Particularly around child sexual abuse, if you're worried about this happening to your child, like how absolutely terrifying. So it's about how do we support parents and carers to do this job and to do it so that they don't feel blamed or shamed, and how do we encourage open conversation with them. I really want to remove the stigma and the blame if we can, because I think it's a really tough gig, and the cost of living now. I can't imagine any parent, particularly parents with multiple children, how they're trying to get by doing this. I think of just the practicalities of transport and parents who are getting on public transport with multiple kids, and so the risks around that as well. When we're thinking about contextual safeguarding, and that harm doesn't just happen in the home, it happens in multiple contexts. It happens when they're being dropped at daycare, that happens when they're at OSH, like it happens when they're at school. So for parents and carers, it's about equipping themselves with the knowledge, but also really the vulnerability to say, hey, like, can I have some help, or can you give me some guidance on this? We have some patchy service responses around the country, which is very disappointing, and that's a structural issue, and that is not on parents and carers, that's on our structures, and we need our systems to get better to support them. But, reach out if you need support. We do have national hotlines that can offer that, but we also, the big factor in a lot of this is connection and relationship, and feeling safe enough to say that I'm worried something might be happening, or I need help, or my child's indicating that something might have happened. So just feeling that they've got that, agency to be able to talk about it is really important. But just, no blame or shame on parents and carers, I think. And a bit, this group of parents and carers, my heart just absolutely breaks for them. I think, I just can't imagine what that would have been like, having to hear.
Absolutely. Beth, you've been a valuable board member who contributed to this review and expert advisory. It's been a big 12 months. Thank you so much for the work that you've done on it, and thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate your perspectives that you've shared.
Okay, thanks, Christine.
That concludes episode 6 of In Plain Sight. The key takeaway for me from this episode is that insight alone does not protect children. Action does. And that reform is not about blame, it's about courage. In our final episode, we'll look ahead at what safeguarding the future really means, and how Queensland can build a system that truly protects children, not just in theory, but in practice. I'm Kirstine, and this is In Plain Sight.